I have been an archivist for 31 standard years. I have cataloged battles, peace treaties, the birth of civilizations, the quiet extinction of others. I have held records that made me weep and records that made me proud to work in the service of memory. This file is different. This file began as a routine incident report from a mid-tier diplomatic transit station in the outer Kareth corridor. A skirmish, a bodyguard action, standard threat response protocol. By the time I finished reading the first witness account, I had stopped taking notes. By the time I finished reading all of them, I understood why this file had been flagged for preservation. This is not just a record of what one human soldier did on a Wednesday afternoon. This is a record of what happened after. That is the part that stunned the galaxy. I present it here in full without summary. The witnesses speak better than I can. Part 1. The Incident at KHARTH Station. Section 1.1. Station Background Briefing. Provided by Station Commander Orth Mail, Kareth Transit Authority. Recorded interview. Standard Year 2847.028. Kareth Station isn't glamorous. I want you to understand that before anything else. People imagine diplomatic stations as these gleaming, cathedral-tall structures with polished floors and atmospheric lighting, and dignitaries floating around in their finest ceremonial wraps. Kareth isn't that. Kareth is a working station. It's a transit hub in the outer corridor, a junction point between 6 different territorial lanes. Freight haulers use it. Medical transports use it. Courier drones refuel here. It has a commercial district that smells like engine coolant and fried protein, a security wing that's perpetually understaffed, and 3 diplomatic suites on the upper tier that were added as an afterthought when the Kareth Accords were first being negotiated 40 years ago. The station handles approximately 11,000 transiting individuals on a busy cycle. On the day of the incident, we were running at roughly 8,000. Busy, but not exceptional. Her Radiance Queen Thesavale IV of the Ervith Sovereignty had requested a stopover. A refueling delay, her vessel needed a core realignment that required stable dock facilities, and Kareth was the closest certified station in the corridor. This was not a state visit. It was not planned. It was a logistical stop, scheduled approximately 18 hours in advance, with a predicted stay of 4 to 6 hours. We activated the diplomatic suite on level 7. We added 2 extra security rotations to the transit corridor, standard procedure. What we did not add, and I want to be honest about this because the inquiry asked me directly, was an enhanced external threat assessment. We were a transit stop. We had no intelligence indicating an elevated threat level for the Ervith Sovereignty in the outer corridor. The Queen was not traveling under her formal royal protocols. She was traveling quietly, privately. I did not think that anyone would know she was here. That assumption was wrong. And the consequences of that assumption fell on someone who wasn't me, and wasn't my security team. They fell on a human soldier named Corporal David Oren, 27 years old, from a place on Earth called Wales. And what he did with those consequences changed things, not just for the Queen, for all of us. Section 1.2, First Witness Account. Provided by Marit Salu, Freight Logistics Coordinator, Kareth Station Level 6. Written Statement. Submitted Standard Year 2847.031. I was working the freight manifest on Level 6 when the alert tone went off. Not the full emergency tone, just the secondary alert, the one that means something is happening, stay where you are. So I stayed where I was, which was behind my console near the service corridor junction, and I watched through the viewport into the Level 7 transit bridge. I want to describe what the Level 7 transit bridge looks like, because I think it matters for understanding what happened. It's a long corridor, maybe 60 meters end to end, wide enough for 2 cargo loaders side by side, Transparent reinforced polymer on both sides, so you can see the docking bays on your left and the station exterior on your right. The floor is a textured dark gray. The lighting is overhead fluorescence, practical, not pretty. At each end there are security checkpoint arches, and in the middle there's a small open area, we call it the junction node, where 4 secondary corridors branch off toward the upper suites. That's where it happened, at the junction node. I saw Queen Thesavale first because of the color. The Irvith wear formal traveling colors that are this deep, particular kind of blue-violet that doesn't look like anything else in the station. She was moving with a small party. 4 attendants, I think. 2 of her own honor guard in their formal armor. I recognized the Irvith scale plate pattern, very distinctive. And 1 human. The human was walking slightly ahead and to her left, which I remember noticing because it seemed like an unusual position for a bodyguard. Not directly beside, not behind, but angled forward and left, like he was already half facing any threat that might come from that direction. Later, people told me he'd been doing that all morning. The station's internal camera logs confirmed it. He was always angled forward and left, toward the most exposed approach vector. He knew, or he felt it, I don't know which. When the figures came out of the secondary corridor, the one that branches toward the freight elevator bay, I didn't process what I was seeing at first. It happened fast. 3 of them. Heavy armor but not military standard, modded, I realized later. Personal guard armor with the identification badges stripped. They weren't carrying standard weapons. They were carrying something I'd never seen before, which the inquiry later identified as compressed plasma dispersion charges. Short range, high spread, designed to cause maximum incapacitation in an enclosed space. The kind of weapon you'd use if you wanted to make sure you didn't miss. The human Corporal Oren, he moved before any alarm sounded. I don't know how else to describe it. One moment he was walking at that slight angle, and the next moment he was already moving, already turning, already stepping directly in front of the Queen, both arms coming up, body squaring to absorb whatever was coming. The first charge went off approximately 2 meters from him. He took it, the full dispersal. He went down hard, not gracefully, and I remember the sound even through the viewport and the ambient station noise. A sharp, concussive pop, and then a kind of secondary resonance that I felt more than heard in my teeth and in my chest. He hit the floor and didn't get up. The Queen's Irvith Honor Guard engaged the attackers. It was over in seconds. Those 2 guards are professional soldiers in their own right, and 3 modded armor fighters with discharged weapons were not a serious challenge for them. The attackers were subdued. But I wasn't watching the fight by then. I was watching the Queen. She had dropped to her knees beside the human soldier. Not stepped back, not retreated, dropped to her knees on the floor of the transit corridor in her traveling clothes. Right beside him. I've worked this station for 9 years. I've seen dignitaries step over injured workers. I've seen ambassadors walk past emergency situations because it wasn't their jurisdiction. I've seen creatures who could have helped choose not to. I had never seen anything like what I was looking at. She put her hand on his chest. She said something to him. I couldn't hear it through the viewport, but I saw her face, and I've been thinking about that face ever since. I was one of the first security personnel on scene after the alert. Reached the level 7 junction node approximately 90 seconds after the initial charge detonation, which I know sounds slow, but we had to come through the checkpoint arch, and it was a manual seal situation, so we were moving as fast as the station allowed. When I got there, the 3 attackers were already secured. Irvith Honor Guard had them pinned against the corridor wall, professional, efficient, no excess force. The attendants were clustered near the junction entrance, keeping clear. And Corporal Oren was on the floor. I've done emergency response training. I've seen plasma dispersion injuries before, in simulation, and in one real incident 2 years prior. What I saw on Corporal Oren was consistent with a close-range, partial exposure hit, which, given that the charge went off at approximately 2 meters, told me that he had physically blocked most of the dispersal with his body. Not with any equipment, not with a shield or a deflector, with himself. His armor, and I want to be specific here, because this came up extensively in the inquiry. His armor was standard issue Terran military escort grade. It's rated for ballistic and moderate energy deflection. It is not rated for compressed plasma dispersion. It was never designed to absorb that kind of hit. It did what it could, which was shield his internal organs from the worst of the thermal component. It did not protect him from the concussive wave. His helmet had microfractures across the visor. His left shoulder plate was fused to the underlayer. His gloves were vapor damaged enough that they had to be cut away at the medical bay. He was conscious when I reached him, just barely, eyes open, tracking, which, frankly, given what he'd absorbed, I found remarkable. The Queen was still kneeling beside him. She hadn't moved. I should note, and this is relevant, that Queen Thesavale IV is not a small person. Urvith monarchs of her lineage tend toward height and physical presence. She stands nearly 2 meters tall, and in full traveling formal wear she is an imposing figure. Seeing her kneeling on a station floor in an emergency zone was genuinely disorienting. It didn't match any protocol I'd ever been trained for. I didn't know where to look, professionally speaking. She looked up at me when I approached, and she said, in universal standard which she speaks without accent, she said, "How long until your medical team arrives?" Not he needs help, not someone help him. She was already tracking the timeline, already thinking operationally. I told her 2 minutes. She looked back at him and said, "Hold on, Corporal, 2 minutes." He said something back. I only caught part of it because his voice was rough and the station ambient was loud. But I think, and I've gone over this 100 times in my memory, I think he said, "Already ahead of you, ma'am." Corporal Davith Oren, human Terran male, age 27, presented to Kareth Station Medical Facility approximately 6 minutes post-incident, in a state of conscious but deteriorating stability. Primary injuries, sustained from compressed plasma dispersion charge at close range. First-degree thermal burns across approximately 18% of body surface, concentrated on left forearm, upper chest, and left side of neck. The armor mitigated what would otherwise have been significantly more severe thermal trauma. Without the armor, the thermal exposure at that range would likely have caused fatal burns across 40 to 50% of body surface. Severe concussive trauma. The concussive wave from a compressed plasma charge at 2 meters is significant. Corporal Oren presented with bilateral tympanic membrane rupture, complete deafness in both ears at time of presentation, which has since partially resolved. Cranial impact imaging showed 3 hairline fractures in the frontal bone, consistent with the helmet visor microfracturing pattern described in the security report. There was subarachnoid hemorrhage, a small bleed on the surface of the brain that required immediate pharmacological intervention. Left shoulder joint dislocation, compounded by the armor fusion damage, requiring surgical separation and realignment. Systemic plasma wave shock. This is a secondary injury pattern specific to dispersion weapon exposure. The body's electrical systems essentially experience a disruption analogous to a surge. In humans, this manifests as cardiac arrhythmia, involuntary muscle response, and temporary loss of proprioception. Corporal Oren was experiencing all 3 upon arrival. My clinical assessment: he was alive because his armor had absorbed the thermal component. He was badly hurt because nothing had absorbed the concussive and electrical components. He would recover. I was confident of that within the first hour of treatment, but recovery would take weeks, and there would be lasting effects. I will note, because several journalists have asked me about this subsequently, whether I believe the soldier knew what he was absorbing when he stepped in front of that charge. My answer is, I don't know what he knew about the specific weapon, but the injuries suggest he stepped into the dispersal field while it was already in the initial detonation phase. He didn't step in front of an unfired weapon. He stepped in front of one that was already going off. Whether he knew that or simply didn't care is a question above my clinical expertise. Right, so I've been told to write this down. I'm going to write it down in the way I'd tell it to someone at home, because they said it should be in my own words, and this is how I talk. I've been on diplomatic security detail for 3 years. Before that, I was standard infantry, 2 deployments in contested systems at the edge of Terran space. I'm not a special operator. I'm not extraordinary. I'm a corporal who is reasonably good at his job and who takes it seriously, which apparently is already more than some people expect from a human in a galactic posting. The detail for Queen Thesivale's transit stop was assigned to me 48 hours before the stopover, when her vessel filed the emergency dock request. I was the senior human military attaché on station at the time, which is a fancy way of saying there were 3 of us and the other 2 were on different rotation cycles. So I got the posting. I read her file. I do that. Some people think it's excessive for a transit stop. I think it's the job. You learn who you're protecting. Her file was interesting. She's not a figurehead monarch. The Earth sovereignty is a genuine ruling structure, and she administers it. She's been in office 11 years since her father died. She inherited a sovereignty with 3 active territorial disputes and resolved 2 of them through negotiation within her first 4 years. She's controversial at home for reasons I didn't fully understand from the file, but the summary was, she makes decisions that her nobility doesn't always like, and she makes them anyway. I respected that before I ever met her. When I met her, when she came off the docking bridge and we were introduced, she looked at me for a moment and said, "In Universal Standard, you've read my file." I said yes. She said, "Good. What did you think?" Which is not something a dignitary usually asks their temporary security escort. I told her I thought the resolution of the Verith territorial dispute showed strategic patience that most politicians don't have. She considered that for a moment, then nodded, and we got moving. The transit corridors were standard. I did what I always do. I walked ahead left. I tracked the approach vectors. I logged the secondary corridor branching points as potential concealment locations. I noted the freight elevator access on Level 7's secondary branch, which was a blind approach with limited camera coverage. I'm not going to pretend I sensed something before it happened, in some dramatic way. What I sensed was that the secondary corridor junction near the freight elevator access was a structural vulnerability, and I was already angled toward it because of that assessment. That's not instinct. That's reading a floor plan. When the figures came out of that corridor, I genuinely don't know, maybe half a second of processing time. Long enough to see the weapons. Long enough to know what they were. I'd seen dispersion charges in a training module, though not live. Long enough to do the math. The math was simple. The weapons had a spread pattern that made individual evasion ineffective at that range. The Queen was directly behind me and to my right. The charge was already in initial detonation. I could see the dispersal beginning at the barrel. I stepped into it. I want to be clear about something. I'm not being heroic about this. I'm not going to tell you it was a noble sacrifice or that I thought of anything meaningful in that half second. I thought, she's behind me. I thought, this is the job, and I moved. The rest of it, what happened after, I was mostly not conscious for. The medical team tells me I was technically conscious when they arrived, which I take their word for because my memory of the first 2 hours is like trying to watch a video that keeps buffering. I do remember the floor being cold. I remember that the Queen was talking to me, and even though I couldn't hear anything, The blast had taken out my hearing at that point. I could see her face, and I could tell from her expression that she was saying something that she meant. I don't know what she said. I found out later, in a way I was not expecting. General Savick, I write to you not as a head of state addressing a military command structure, but as a person addressing another person. I hope that distinction is understood and accepted. 4 days ago, one of your soldiers sustained serious injury in the performance of his duty. I have been told his name is Corporal David Oren, and I have been told he is recovering. I am relieved to hear it. I would like you to know that my relief is not ceremonial. I was present, General. I was present for the entire event, including the moment when Corporal Oren placed himself between a detonating weapon and my person. I want to be precise about the timeline because I believe precision matters here. The charge was already in initial detonation. He did not step in front of an unfired weapon. He stepped into an active dispersal field. He did this knowing what he was doing because he is a trained soldier and he understood the nature of the weapon he was facing. I have reviewed many acts of service and protection in my 11 years as a ruling monarch. I review the honor guard records of my own palace. I have awarded commendations. I have read after-action reports. I have never read anything like the security footage from Kareth Station Level 7. I am writing to formally request the following. First, that Corporal Oren be provided with the finest available medical care, regardless of cost, for the full duration of his recovery. I am prepared to allocate Irvith's sovereignty medical resources to supplement Terran military medical provision if this would be of benefit. Please communicate this to the relevant authorities. Second, that I be permitted to personally visit Corporal Oren when he is sufficiently recovered to receive visitors, and that this visit be facilitated at his convenience and comfort, not mine. Third, I wish to discuss something of a more formal nature. I recognize this may require significant consideration on your part and on the part of the Terran military command structure. I ask only that you hear it before making any determination. I will wait for your response. With sincere respect. Thesavale IV, Sovereign of the Irvith Dominion. Read the attached correspondence from Queen Thesavale before you read the rest of this memo. Done good. I'll be direct. I've been in this position for 14 years. I have received formal commendations, diplomatic thank you notes, and state gifts from dozens of sovereign entities across the galaxy. I have never received a personal letter from a head of state 4 days after an incident that opens with the phrase, "I write to you not as a head of state, but as a person." I have also reviewed the Kareth Station camera footage. I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. First, get Oren access to whatever medical care he needs. The Irvith offer stands accepted if it helps him. Do not let pride or bureaucracy stand in the way. Second, I need you to find out who Oren is. I mean actually who he is. His file is clean, 2 deployments, commendation for the Rithais corridor action in 2844, solid evaluations, no disciplinary notes. But a file doesn't tell me who a person is. Talk to his colleagues. Talk to anyone who's worked a detail with him. Because the Queen's letter hints at something formal, and before I respond to something formal from a sovereignty head of state, I want to understand exactly what kind of person is at the center of this. My gut tells me we have something extraordinary here. My gut is not usually wrong. Savick. Yes, I know David. We went through diplomatic security training together, same cohort. Roomed next to each other at the outer corridor posting house for about 8 months. What's he like? Quiet, but not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The kind of quiet where you realize later he was listening to everything and remembers all of it. He reads like physical books, actual bound books which he orders from Earth and which take months to arrive, but he waits for them. He's got a small collection in his quarters, mostly history. Military history, political history, some philosophy, I think. He talks about them if you ask. He doesn't complain, which sounds simple but isn't. In diplomatic postings, complaining is practically a recreational activity. The food, the quarters, the protocols, the hours, the disrespect you get from certain dignitaries who don't take humans seriously yet. David doesn't engage with any of that. Not because he's suppressing it, you can tell the difference, but because it genuinely doesn't seem to register as worth the energy. What he cares about is doing the job right. He gets almost, I don't want to say angry because it doesn't come out as anger. He gets very quiet and focused if he thinks something is being done carelessly. Like if a protocol is being skipped because someone's impatient, or if a security assessment is being watered down because a commanding officer doesn't want to make waves with a dignitary. He'll say something. He always says it calmly, but he says it. Is he brave? I mean, yeah. But not in the way people usually mean it. He's not reckless. He's not the person who charges in because he can't think of anything better. He assesses, he decides, and then he acts without hesitation. There's a difference between those two things, and David is firmly in the second category. The Kareth thing, I've seen the footage. Everyone on our division has seen the footage by now. And yeah, it was extraordinary. But if you'd asked me before it happened whether David Oren was capable of doing that, I would have said yes without blinking. That's the thing. It wasn't a surprise. It was just David doing the job the way David does the job. I hope he knows that. I hope someone tells him. They told me about the Queen's letter. General Savick forwarded the relevant portions to Colonel Hadest, who told me in person during a visit. I didn't know what to say, which is unusual for me. I'm generally all right with words. I asked if I could read it directly. They sent me the full text. I read it twice. Then I put it down and looked out the viewport at the station exterior for a long time. Kareth Station's exterior is not scenic. It's a working station, as I said. Cargo tugs, fuel lines, the occasional vessel making its approach. But I find industrial exteriors calming. Something about the orderly movement of things doing their purpose. I thought about what she'd written, specifically the part about precision, about the timing. She'd clocked exactly what I'd done and she'd put it in writing, for a general officer formally. That mattered to me more than I'd expected. And then I thought, what does she want to discuss? Because the letter hinted at something. Something of a more formal nature. I'm a corporal. Formal natures don't usually involve corporals, at least not in the way that generates correspondence between heads of state and generals. I asked Colonel Hadest what he thought it was. He gave me a look that I've since learned to translate as, I know, but I'm not going to tell you yet, so just recover and stop worrying about it. I recovered and kept worrying about it. I was on duty when Queen Thesavale arrived at the medical facility. It was a very quiet arrival. She came with 2 attendants and 1 Ervith guard, no ceremony, no announcement beyond a brief communication to the facility administrator 40 minutes prior, which I think was deliberate. She didn't want it to be an event. The administrator met her at the facility entrance and offered to escort her personally. She thanked him and asked if she could just be shown to the ward, so I walked them there. It's a standard medical ward, I want to say that. Nothing impressive. Gray floors, ambient lighting tuned for patient comfort, equipment arrays along the corridor. She didn't seem to notice any of it. She was focused. Corporal Oren was in a recovery room at the end of the ward. He'd been moved out of intensive monitoring 2 days earlier, ahead of schedule, which Dr. Vaught attributed to what she diplomatically called exceptional patient stubbornness. His hearing had partially returned. His shoulder was in a regeneration brace. He was sitting up in the bed with a physical book in his lap when we arrived, which I found almost theatrically perfect, though it was completely genuine. I'd seen him reading that same book 3 days in a row. I knocked and opened the door. He looked up, saw who was standing there, put the book down. He started to move. I think he was trying to stand up, which would have been medically inadvisable given his shoulder brace, and the fact that his balance was still somewhat affected by the residual inner ear damage. The Queen made a gesture with her hand, very slight, just a small lateral movement that said clearly, without words, don't. He settled back. She came in. Her attendant stayed at the door, which I thought was a considered choice. She sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed, which put her below his eye level. He was elevated by the bed angle, and I think she chose that position deliberately too. I stepped back to the doorway. I wasn't sure if I should leave or stay in case he needed something. I stayed because medical protocol, but I tried to be invisible. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. He looked back at her. Then she said, "How are you feeling?" And he said, "Better than last week." Which is a low bar, but still. She made a sound that I can only describe as a brief, genuine laugh. Not a polite laugh, an actual one. And then they talked, for almost an hour. I heard pieces of it. The door was open. I was nearby. He asked her about the sovereignty. She asked him about Wales, which apparently she had researched between the incident and the visit. They talked about the Carruth Accords in a way that was clearly two people who had both read the original documents and had opinions about them. At one point, their voices got quieter and I couldn't hear any more, which felt right. Some conversations belong only to the people having them. When she left, she paused at the door and said something to him. He nodded. She looked at him for one more moment, a long look, the kind that's about something other than what's being said out loud, and then she left. I went in to check his vitals. He was looking at the door. I asked him if he needed anything. He said, "No, I'm good." He said it the way people say something when they actually mean it. She asked me, during the visit, why I did it. I told her what I told everyone, that it was the job, that the math was straightforward, that I was the closest body between her and the dispersal field and I moved into it. She listened to all of that and then she said, "That's what you tell people." And I said, "That's also what I tell myself." She said, "Is there a difference?" I thought about it. I said, "Not usually. This time, maybe a little." She waited. I said, "I read your file. I knew who you were before I stood in that corridor. I knew what you'd done with the Verith dispute. I knew you'd taken positions your own nobility hated because you thought they were right. That doesn't change the math, but it's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You stepped in front of a detonating weapon for a person you'd known for approximately 40 minutes. I said yes. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that it is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. I also want you to understand that regardless of your answer, what I intend to do is not conditional." I said I understood. She said, "Do you believe that what you did had value beyond the tactical?" It's a strange question in a medical ward, but she meant it, so I took it seriously. I said, "I think the moment where one person puts their body between harm and another person, when they don't have to, I think that moment has a shape that's bigger than the two people in it. I don't know how to say it more precisely than that." She said, "You said that very precisely." Then she told me what she intended to do. I didn't know what to say. She said she didn't need me to say anything yet. She said she'd be back in 3 weeks when the formal component would be ready, and that I should just focus on recovery. Then she left. I looked at the door for a while after that. Then I picked up my book, but I didn't read it. I just held it. I have served the Ervith sovereignty in a diplomatic capacity for 22 years. I have served Queen Thesavale specifically for 11 of those years. I know her well. Or I thought I did. When she called me from Carruth Station and told me what she was planning, I was silent for long enough that she asked if the communication had dropped. I said, "Your Radiance, this has not been done in 700 years. She said, "I know." I said, the High Council will object. She said, I expect they will. I said, the territorial lords in the eastern corridors will object more strongly. She said, I've already written that letter 3 times. I've gotten better at it. I said, this will be a political disruption of significant magnitude. She said, yes, Sareth, I know. That's partly the point. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, I'll prepare the documentation. She said, thank you, make it formal, full ceremonial record. I want it in the Galactic Archive. I want to provide some context here, for readers who may not be familiar with Ervith sovereignty tradition and law. The Order of the Sovereign Shield is an honor that exists within the Ervith legal and cultural framework. It is not simply a commendation or a medal. It is a formal recognition, entered into the sovereign's permanent record, that designates the recipient as a person who, in the judgment of the sovereign, risked life and body for the preservation of the sovereign line. It carries with it certain specific rights and protections under Ervith law. It was last awarded 703 years ago. It was last awarded to an Ervith citizen. It has never, not once, in the entire recorded history of the Ervith sovereignty spanning approximately 1100 years, been awarded to a non-Ervith person. This was what Queen Thesavale IV proposed to award Corporal David Oren, age 27, from Wales, currently in recovery at the Carith Station Medical Facility with a shoulder in a regeneration brace and partial hearing loss. I prepared the documentation. I made it formal. I made sure it would be in the Galactic Archive. And I quietly wondered what the next 3 weeks were going to look like for all of us. They were not, as it turned out, boring. I'll be direct, I was wrong. I don't enjoy saying that. I've been in the High Council for 30 years. I'm not accustomed to being definitively, publicly wrong about something I held with conviction. But I was wrong, and I'm putting it in writing for this archive because if I'm going to have my objections preserved, I should also have my correction preserved. When Her Radiance informed the High Council of her intention to award the Order of the Sovereign Shield to a Terran human, my objection was immediate and substantial. The Order is an Ervith institution. It carries Ervith legal weight. Extending it to a non-citizen, to a non-Ervith, to someone who operates outside our legal framework. I argued that this diluted the honor, created jurisdictional complications, and set a precedent that could be used in ways we could not predict. I said all of this, forcefully, in the council chamber, in written submissions, and in a private meeting with Her Radiance that I asked for specifically. She heard me out completely, every word. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Counselor Met, a man from another world and another civilization, who had no obligation to us beyond a transit stop assignment, stepped into the activation field of a dispersal weapon to keep me alive. What would our honor mean if we looked at that act and said, this is not quite enough for our particular tradition? I said, Your Radiance, the tradition exists for reasons. She said, it does, and I have read all of them. The order was established to recognize an act that a sovereign designates as demonstrating the highest quality of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. I have reviewed every prior recipient's file in the historical archive. Corporal Oren's act meets the standard. I would argue it exceeds it, on every criterion the order's founding documents define. I said he is not Ervith. She said that is not one of the criteria. I didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. I went back and read the founding documents. She was right. The criteria had never specified Ervith citizenship. That restriction had accrued through practice and assumption, and the fact that no non-Ervith person had ever done what the criteria required. Until now. I withdrew my objection 11 days before the ceremony. I attended the ceremony. I watched Corporal Oren stand in the Ervith formal hall, still with a slight favoring of his left shoulder, still with the particular careful posture of someone whose inner ear hasn't fully recalibrated, and received the order from Her Radiance's own hands. I don't have the words for what I felt in that moment. I'm not a sentimental man, but something shifted. I think the right word is expansion. Like a room I thought I knew the dimensions of turned out to be larger than I'd measured. Section 4.3. Account of journalist PLLISVOR. I broke the story. I want to be honest about how that happened, because the clean version, journalist discovers extraordinary story, isn't quite accurate. The more accurate version is that a source at the Cardiff Transit Authority sent me the station camera footage 48 hours after the incident with a message that said, "You should see this." I watched it, then I watched it again. Then I called my editor and said, "I need to go to Cardiff Station right now, and I need you to trust me on this." She trusted me, which is why I have the editor I have. I arrived at Cardiff Station 6 days after the incident. Oren was already in recovery. The Queen had been there and left. The 3 attackers were in custody. The official statement from the station authority described the incident as a security disruption that had been successfully contained by diplomatic security personnel, which was accurate and told approximately 15% of the story. I requested interviews. I got several: the station commander, 2 security specialists, the medical officer. I got the footage released under open record provisions. I spent 3 days on Cardiff before I had enough. Then I sat down and I wrote it, not a breaking news piece, a feature, long form. I took 4 days to write it, which my editor felt was excessive and I felt was necessary. I wanted it to feel right. I wanted the people in it to feel real. I published it on Standard Year 2847.045. By Standard Year 2847.046, it had been read by approximately 400 million unique readers across the galactic network. By Standard Year 2847.047, that number was closer to 2 billion. I've been a journalist for 19 years. I've written stories that got attention. I have never, not once in my career, published something that moved through the galactic information network the way this story moved. My inbox at the news network received over 300,000 direct messages in the first week. Messages from every species I know of and several I had to look up. Messages in languages my translation software struggled with. Messages from species that don't communicate primarily in text and had to use intermediary programs to send them at all. I read every one I could. Not all 300,000, I'm being honest, not ridiculous, but I read hundreds, and the ones that stayed with me weren't from the beings who were already inclined to think well of humans. They were from the ones who wrote things like, "I did not expect this," and "I did not know humans did this," and "I had to write to someone about this because I didn't know what to do with it." One message came from a Thraxis elder. The Thraxis are notoriously isolationist, not given to external emotional expression, who wrote, "We watched the footage. We do not understand why we feel the way we feel. Please explain humans to us." I wrote back. I said I'd been trying to explain humans for 19 years, and I'd gotten better at it, but I wasn't done yet. I don't think any of us are done yet.